Suspensions and expulsions, or exclusionary discipline, stem from zero-tolerance policies from the 1990s to address school crime related to weapons and drugs. But use of exclusionary discipline has been used to punish students for nonviolent offenses, with a higher percentage of students of color or students with disabilities being affected. Although the use of exclusionary discipline has recently decreased, inequities remain in suspension rates between white students and black students. Black students are still almost twice as likely to be suspended compared to white students. Research has correlated school suspension with an increased risk of worse adult outcomes. For instance, adolescents who are suspended have more involvement with the juvenile and criminal justice systems. Many people assume that these suspended adolescents were inevitably headed for trouble, but research suggests that out-of-school suspension seems to have a causal role in these negative outcomes through labeling or secondary deviance. That is, suspension creates new, long-term deviance due to the social consequences that result from the initial school suspension. In her study, Educational and Criminal Justice Outcomes 12 Years After School Suspension, Dr. Janet Rosenbaum examined the long-term outcomes for young adults who had been suspended during high school compared with young adults with similar backgrounds who were never suspended. Using data from the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescents and Adult Health, Rosenbaum analyzed thousands of respondents that reported having no previous suspension or expulsion at the beginning of the study, with additional years of survey follow-up at 5 and 12 years. Because adolescents who are suspended from school have many risk factors for poor adult outcomes, past studies of school suspension were threatened by potential selection bias. To minimize selection bias, Rosenbaum used propensity matching methods. Similarities between suspended and non-suspended adolescents were established by matching the adolescents on 60 pre-suspension variables in categories of demographics, socioeconomic status, educational achievement, parental risk behavior, substance use, personality, and many others. So rather than apples to oranges comparisons of students who have vastly different pre-suspension variables, this matching allowed for an apples to apples comparison of similar students. Some risk factors predicting school suspension included greater delinquency, lower standardized test scores, lower grade point average, gut feeling decision style, and lower expectations for college attendance. For each suspended student, Rosenbaum identified 3 similar, never suspended students who had exactly the same daily smoking and lifetime marijuana use, and who were the closest matches on a distance measure of age, delinquency score, and grade point average, with the constraint that the never suspended students also had similar estimated probabilities of being suspended. The estimated probabilities of being suspended were computed from 6 demographic variables, 6 socioeconomic variables, 9 health variables, 5 educational variables, and 5 personal variables. This procedure created a group of never suspended students who were predicted to likely be suspended, but happened not to have been suspended. When Rosenbaum analyzed the respondents with a subsample of Black students, she found some variables predicted suspension among Black students, but not the general population, including strict school substance use policy and being a tall male. Rosenbaum compared outcomes 5 and 12 years after a first suspension. 5 years after suspension, suspended students were 2.7 times as likely to be expelled and 3.8 times as likely to be convicted as a minor than matched never suspended students. Among Black students, suspended students were 2.8 times as likely to be expelled and 94% less likely to have earned a bachelor's than matched never suspended students. 12 years after suspension, suspended students were 38% more likely to have been arrested once or more, 51% more likely to have been arrested twice or more, and 49% more likely to have been ever on probation than similar non-suspended youth. Suspended youth were also 24% less likely to have earned a bachelor's than similar non-suspended youth. Among Black students, suspended students were 39% more likely to have been arrested at least once, and twice as likely to have ever been on probation than similar non-suspended Black youth. The study results are consistent with a secondary deviance hypothesis. Adults suspended as youths had lower educational attainment and greater criminal justice involvement than a matched non-suspended group. Not only that, taller height was a suspension risk factor for Black males, but not any other demographic group, suggesting that implicit racial bias influences suspension. In response to the harms of out-of-school suspension, states and cities have set goals to reduce the use of out-of-school suspension, but to achieve goals of reduced suspension, districts and school leadership must support teachers in the transition away from out-of-school suspension by providing alternatives. The most widespread alternative approach to decrease school suspension is positive behavioral interventions and supports. The PBIS framework has 3 levels. Primary prevention of misbehavior is universal school-wide norms for student behavior and positive school climate. Secondary prevention of misbehavior is skills development for at-risk students. And tertiary prevention of misbehavior are reactive supports that gives intensive support for students who misbehave. Using a constructive approach such as PBIS in place of a punitive approach has the benefits of reducing misbehavior and building students' skills, reducing the need for punitive approaches such as out-of-school suspension. Out-of-school suspension policies are discriminatory and have long-term negative effects on suspended students compared with similar non-suspended students. Out-of-school suspension should be reduced as schools move towards positive disciplinary approaches.